all a round of applause, and we'll watch the video. Thank you.
If ever the world sees a time when women shall come together, purely and simply, for the benefit and good of mankind, it will be a power such as the world has never known.
What happens when thousands of women from around the world join forces for the first time in history? In 1975, the United Nations hosted its first ever World Conference on Women in Mexico City, and a global movement was born. Never before had so many women from so many countries gathered to connect and to change the world.
Because we are women who spend thousands of dollars from all parts of the world to come here, and we want to implement this plan so that women all over the world, in whatever culture they are part of, can have equal rights.
Inspired by the power of the Mexico City Conference, the UN declared the next 10 years the decade for women. Women's rights advocates and governments came together again in Copenhagen in 1980 and in Nairobi in 1985.
Without the UN Decade for Women, there would be no global women's movement.
Espacio permitió que nos conozcamos, nos entendamos y pudiéramos hacer unidad.
We strategized, we were smart, we negotiated, we came together to put forward a unified agenda.
At the first 3 UN World Conferences on Women, feminist advocates and their allies met, often for the first time. Together, they were able to accomplish life-changing legal and social reforms. Then, in 1995, Beijing, the landmark 4th World Conference on Women, advocates and leaders from 189 countries established a new vision for gender equality.
We have taken the decisive, irreversible step forward. There is no going back.
It changed the world, it changed me too. I no longer looked at the world as a small sort of planet.
What happened in Beijing was incredible. 30,000 activists, 17,000 officials, and the results were fantastic.
Nations in Beijing united on something seismic, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, an ambitious global agenda calling for reproductive rights, equal access to economic resources, and an end to violence against women and girls.
I can't imagine how we would have done it without the UN conferences.
But 30 years later, there is still so much work to be done. That's why these conferences are not just history. They're also a call to action for the future.
There is so much work that needs to be done to ensure young people's lived experience are brought to the table.
This is the moment to unite. We're here to bring fire to the movement.
These conferences remind us of our collective power to bring about change and to create a fairer, freer world. We can do that together, and only together. Because what happens when thousands of activists, allies, and feminist leaders unite for the future of our planet? Everything. In 2025, we remember our history to reimagine our future.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Wonderful to be back in Reykjavik. As I'm thinking about it, and we talked about this, there's a pathway out. 30 years on, Beijing shows us how. A pathway out's a lot of pressure. We agreed that we think a pathway through, and as Winston Churchill always said, if you're going through hell, just keep going. Don't stop, heaven forbid. And you know, as we've heard again and again, throughout the day, and I'm sure we will continue to hear as we've gathered, there's a lot of forces, crisis and chaos that are trying to divide and distract us in this moment. We can't take the bait. We simply cannot take the bait, and we need to channel the power of what happened in Beijing. And of course, as was said in the beautiful film put together by the UN Foundation, it was a process, of course, of 50 years. But it's more than a process and more than the most progressive document to date that was developed in Beijing for women and girls. We each had personal experiences that shaped our lives and our careers throughout this 50-year process. I was saying backstage, I was born in 1974. I was 1 year old at the 1975 conference, born just in time. And I actually attended the UN Fourth World Conference on Women in 1995 as a 21-year-old college student. Remember that in 1995, if you wanted to understand global women's issues, you had to go there. Google didn't exist. Social media didn't exist. You couldn't Google these things and find out all these issues. You had to go there. You had to connect with women. And that's where I found my tribe, and quite frankly, my inspiration came to then work for Hillary Clinton and Madeleine Albright. But it was that transformative experience there of learning at the feet of extraordinary heroines and giants. Sia, I know that you also were very much shaped by these conferences, both the Cairo Population Conference and then Nairobi. You attended as a youth delegate in 1985. And I think another reason why these conferences are so valuable is that they give us the common language. One of the biggest things to come out of Nairobi, of course, the Third World Conference on Women, was the concept of gender-based violence, domestic violence. There was no term for it. People knew it was happening, but it was this idea of women coming together and for the first time being able to sort of share notes on what was going on, develop the common language, and from there, of course, came laws and advocacy, but until you have that, you can't move things forward. Can you talk a little bit about the experience that you had in Nairobi, but also through the process of being involved in these UN conferences? But you also authored a companion report to this film that looked back over 50 years. Yes. Talk about that and what inspired you. What did you learn from that report?
Thank you so much, Alyse. I think the film shows what inspired us. It was the women. And it's always wonderful to see the research come alive in that film. You may be seeing these postcards around, and you can access the full report and an interactive website, as well as watch the video again if you want. So what inspired us? My co-authors, Stephanie Ula, Myra Buvanich, and I are three feminists from three different generations and places: North America, Latin America, and Africa. And we brought to the table different experiences of feminist advocacy with the UN. And as we conducted the research, which involved reviewing documents, scouring the archives of the UN, of the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations, and most excitedly interviewing movement elders and youth activists, we realized, like Alyse, we're all part of this story. And it's a continuing story. And we felt like we were losing our history. And in losing our history, we were losing lessons learned for the way forward. So that was what sort of inspired us. And then we each brought our personal journey to the table. So I turned 18 at the 1985 Third World Conference on Women in Nairobi. And for me, it was a spectacular coming of age. I was part of a Kenyan secondary school delegation. The women of the world came to my hometown, and they changed me. I saw my mother and my sister and my aunties, yes, aunties, engaged in advocacy. I met women from national liberation struggles from South Africa and Namibia. I met artists and authors. I saw how women from the global South were leading the way. I made friends that I still have today, women who shaped how I see the world. And that was my story. But when we were doing the research, we heard so many other stories about how personal experiences and relationships built on trust enabled the cross-pollination of ideas, built better strategies, and advanced political gains. but also at a more personal level, how those relationships sustained us as individuals and strengthened our movements. So just a few examples, Alyse. The Global South Network, Dawn, emerged from individual friendships that was started in 1975 in Mexico City. They coalesced in the preparations for 1985 in Nairobi, and they continue today. And those friendships and that solidarity resulted in a new feminist development agenda, really rooted in the leadership of the Global South. Indigenous women meeting for the first time in Nairobi didn't even share a common language, but they created solidarity and they created bonds. By Beijing, they had worked together to launch the Beijing Declaration of Indigenous Women. We saw it happen in alliances built between women of the Global South and women of the Global North to advance strategic agendas despite differences across borders, races, economic status, and even ideologies. And more recently, we heard it echoed by youth activists, two of which you saw on the video, who were involved in the writing of the Young Feminist Manifesto during the generation equality process. Movement elder and co-founder of Dawn, Peggy Anthropos, calls it magic and chemistry, the friendships and the relationships that drive us and sustain us. So especially in these challenging times, feminist friendship and solidarity remains an important time of sustaining us both as individual advocates and as movements. And very grateful to the Reykjavik Global Forum for being yet another data point of why it's so important that we come together across borders and we continue to build this movement.
Absolutely. Geeta, I want to come to you. Of course, your career has been set against the backdrop of these conferences and really different turning points of your life, but also most recently having been the U.S. Ambassador for Global Women's Issues until 9 months or so ago. You really had a front row seat at the dismantling of so much of what you, and of course Ambassador Milan Verveer was here earlier today speaking, so much of what you and she and so many others had built. Talk a bit about the impact both of the last 50 years of those conferences, but then also where you think we are right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. Just like you and Sia, this drumbeat of conferences shaped my educational choices and my career throughout. So to date myself and point out that I'm the oldest on the stage here, in 75, when it was the first International Year of Women, was when I graduated from college. That's when my eyes opened to the inequities and indignities that women experience. And I decided to find out why that was. And that guided my career throughout. 85 was when I finished my PhD. That was the Nairobi conference. And 95 was when Beijing happened. By then, I was in the US, no longer in India, and working for the International Center for Research on Women, where our task then was to really gather the evidence to implement effectively the Beijing Platform for Action. So completely defined everything that I did through my career. So you can imagine the despair I feel and how dismayed and disappointed I am with the fact that the progress that we made across all these years is now being held back, reversed. And I saw that most clearly when I was ambassador in the State Department, because through my travels, there were two things I'll point out to all of you. One was being in multilateral fora where all of us, like-minded countries and governments, were caught flat-footed. We'd be scrambling, trying to coordinate, whereas the other side, the anti-rights folks, were so well-organized, had the best lawyers, with one message, one strategy, all prepared in advance. That was one. That's when I knew we were in trouble. The second was that when I traveled, in all my travels, I took it a point to meet with parliamentarians, with women in the media, public-facing role, women leaders, and every single one of them said in some form or the other that they would never recommend their jobs to someone from the younger generation. That put the fear of God in me, I have to tell you, because if there's one thing we have succeeded in seeing is up to that point was an increase in representation of women in political office and in public-facing roles over time. So those two things made me realize that I really needed to look at the data on how strong was this anti-rights movement and what was it doing. You've heard a lot about it today over the day, so I won't repeat a lot of it, but I'll tell you, thank you to the European Parliamentary Forum and the Global Philanthropy Project that we have the data now of how well that movement is funded, what tactics and strategies they have used. I have to tell you, the most startling fact is, based on a conservative estimate and not full data, the other side is 6 times better funded than we are on the progressive side. 6 times, in the billions. And over the past 30 years, they've been organizing, while we've become a little complacent with the Beijing Platform for Action and thought it would all proceed as planned. So they have really used that money to establish a network of organizations across the world and then coordinate their activities transnationally with single messaging and with basically tactics and strategies to undermine democracy. And the tip of the spear for that has been to undermine women's rights and gender equality. That they have seen as the way to really undermine human rights and undermine democracy, and all the authoritarian leaders around the world have helped to fund some of that. So it's come from countries, it's come from private sources. And so I will say to you that one of the most successful things they have done is establish these organizations with innocuous names, like the International Center for Family, or, and these conferences like CPAC and the Pan-African Conference on the Family, ways in which they could gather and do what we did. So what have we seen through this data? They learned from us.
Yeah.
They have co-opted and deployed and used the very same tactics that we used prior to Beijing.
Yeah. Well, of course, we couldn't have another Beijing conference, a 5th World Conference on Women, because we all know the agenda would roll backwards.
Right.
But there is incredible greatness about coming together, right?
Yes.
We saw that in the 4 conferences. So I want to turn back to you, Sia, because you spent a lot of time, really researching the UN, understanding the value of the UN, which we know the UN is under attack, undervalued, underfunded around the world. And it is, in so many ways, the last place where countries can come together. So what did you learn about the UN through this research project?
We were really pleasantly surprised, even though Myra, Stephanie, and I had all been involved in some way in gender equality advocacy at the UN, that the key finding of our research was that the UN was a movement-building space. And we didn't expect that. And it is exactly as imperfect as it is, as you say, Alyse, it's just a really consequential space for gender equality. The UN conferences and the spaces in between them created really vital touch points and a cadence of connection and cross-pollination of ideas that enabled movement building and transformative change. They enabled transnational organizing by women. They enabled women to interact directly with their own and other governments, creating accountability that we just had not seen at a global space, at a global level. They also, and continue to do so today, link grassroots, national, regional, and global advocacy. And that's critical to make sure that the diverse experiences of girls and women around the world inform global policy and standards, because that's the only way that those policies and standards are truthful and sustainable. The other thing that we learned was that investing in women's movements is critical. What was achieved during the women's conferences was sustained by multi-year support, often by funders who themselves identified as feminists. They saw themselves as part of the movement, and that made all the difference. The other thing we keep reminding ourselves of in this situation that Geeta has described so well, where things are so challenging, is that what looks neat and tidy 30 years later actually was really challenging and really difficult. The UN wasn't built for us, but whenever it has delivered and whenever it has done better, it's because of us. And that's why it's so important that we continue to engage.
Thank you. Geeta, I want to bring you back in the little bit of time we have left, because I think it's so important that we leave here with a message of hope, glimmers of what's working around the world. I think one of the things that you had said earlier to me is that the anti-rights movement doesn't fund the way we fund project-based.
Yes.
They fund people and ideas, which
Exactly.
is absolutely critical. What other ideas can we take from them, or what else do you see around the world that's working and giving you hope right now?
Well, I'll tell you what's giving me hope is that we've done it before, so we can do it again.
Yeah.
That's what's giving me hope.
Yeah.
The thing that we need, though, and I, in a previous session, somebody put up money, money, money. That's what we need. We desperately need the funding. Every philanthropist in the room, every donor, bilateral, private, needs to understand that it's not just the quantity of money, but as you said, it's the quality of that money. What is that money going to be used for? It should be supporting movements, organizations, people, leaders with the right thoughts, missions. Movement building, essentially, is what we need money for. So that's a critical ingredient. The second thing is we really need to form coalitions. We need to work across sectors, issues, no longer sort of create fractures, work across social justice movements. We're all one, and we can only succeed if we come together. That's the second point that I would make. And I would say that if we do that, we can come up with a common narrative, with some strategies. We can create inside-outside strategies. We have a weakened UN, as Sia said now. It's been hurt with the lack of funding. And the geopolitics are not right for us. So we have to find the spaces like this one. So I want to say thank you to Hannah and to the Reykjavik Global Forum. We need to replicate this at the regional level so that we can do what we did prior to Beijing. That drumbeat of conferences allowed us to debate, discuss, come together. Maybe some of that can be done digitally, but I really think we need the spaces to do that. And finally, I'll say ultimately what it takes courage. The intimidation is real. The threats are real. They're online and offline. So what it takes is courage. And as my friend Verena Winder said so beautifully the other day to me, courage has two daughters: anger. So keep that anger boiling in your belly, because that can be the fuel. But then you need hope, because that's the only way you can propel that anger forward into action. Yeah, so keep the courage going. Without the courage, we're not going to move forward. And for my personal sake, 50 years I have spent on this work. Before I leave this earth, make it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I tell you, what gives me hope is our network at Vital Voices, 47,000 women across 188 countries. And what I see is that they use hope. They spread hope, and that's what they use to drive change. And spreading fear, which is what we see on display around the world, is not going to ultimately work and is not going to drive change. And people are going to recognize that. We brought together 100 women leaders from across our network a year ago to look at democracy, to look at the anti-rights movement. And rather than focusing on the negative, we said, look, they got a playbook. We need our own playbook. And we created the anti-authoritarian playbook, Lessons from Women to Women. And I feel like I could be schooled by so many women across our network in how to get through in these truly tough times. And I think it is so much about collaboration. So Hannah and everyone here at the forum, thank you so much, and onward.
Thank you. Upward and onward.